On a scorched hilltop in what is now southeastern Turkey, something rose from the earth that had no business existing. Limestone pillars weighing as much as 10 tons, carved with foxes and vultures and scorpions, arranged in vast ceremonial circles. No metal tools cut them, no writing recorded them. No farming civilization stood behind them. And when archaeologists finally understood what they had found, they did not revise the textbooks, they threw them out. For decades, one question drove the fiercest debate: who actually built this place? And how? Wild theories filled the silence. Then ancient DNA entered the record, and it did not answer the question the way anyone expected, because the people behind those stones were not gods, not strangers, not a vanished master race. Truth had been lying in the ground the whole time, waiting to understand why this place broke the rules. You first have to stand inside it, at least in your imagination. Picture a hilltop in southeastern Turkey, not far from the Syrian border. Dry, rolling plains stretching toward the horizon in every direction. Now picture enormous T-shaped pillars of limestone rising from the earth. Some nearly 5.5 meters tall, each weighing several tons. Arranged in sweeping circular enclosures with 2 even larger pillars standing at the center of each ring like silent guardians. These are not rough, desperate scratchings in stone. They are works of deliberate, practiced artistry. Foxes, vultures, scorpions, wild boar, snakes, and gazelles carved across the surfaces with a skill and patience that still impresses professional sculptors today. Many of the pillars appear to have arms and hands. Some wear what look like sculpted loincloths. The people who dig here believe they were meant to represent human figures, enormous faceless men frozen in stone, presiding over something we still do not fully understand. Now consider the chronological context, because this is where it becomes genuinely difficult to absorb. Stonehenge and the Great Pyramids of Giza are rightly counted among the most astonishing achievements in human history. This hilltop predates them both by thousands of years, reaching back approximately 11,500 years into the past, which means that by the time the Egyptians were laying the first stones of the pyramids, this place was already impossibly ancient. Think of everything humanity has crowded into the intervening centuries: ancient Greece, the Roman Empire, the Renaissance, the Industrial Revolution, the atomic bomb, the internet. Now take that entire span, more than double it, and place yourself at the very beginning. That is how far back these pillars stand. And here is the part that broke archaeology open. At the time those stones were being raised, none of the things we associate with monumental building existed yet. No domesticated crops, no pottery, no metal tools, no wheeled transport, no writing, no empire, no state. By every conventional marker of what we call civilization, the people responsible for this place were not supposed to be capable of building it. They had stone, and somehow that was enough to quarry pillars the weight of a loaded truck, carve them with the steady precision of trained artists, and stand them upright in patterns that took planning no one believed those people possessed. That contradiction is the whole problem in a single image. A monument that demanded organization, labor, and vision on a scale we reserve for civilizations. Built by people who on paper had none of the tools a civilization is supposed to require. The conventional story of how humans climb toward complexity simply had no shelf to put this on. So the moment the site surfaced and the world understood how old it truly was, a single question began pulling at everyone who looked at it. If the people we thought lived here could not have done this, then who did? And the answers came rushing in long before the evidence was ready to support them. For all its strangeness, the site did not announce itself. It was first noted during an archaeological survey in the early 1960s, recorded and then almost entirely ignored. The surveyor saw a hill scattered with broken limestone and assumed it was a medieval cemetery or something, equally unremarkable. The great pillars were there the whole time, waiting just beneath the surface. But no one understood what they were looking at. For more than 3 decades, the place sat in the record as a footnote, until a German archaeologist named Klaus Schmidt came to see it for himself and recognized in an afternoon what others had walked past for decades. What Schmidt found as his team began to dig was almost disorienting. Beneath only a few centimeters of accumulated soil lay the tops of the great standing pillars. As they went deeper, a full ring of carved stone emerged, then another ring, then another. A geomagnetic survey eventually revealed at least 20 separate buried enclosures spread across the hill, most of them still untouched beneath the earth. Schmidt understood immediately that he was not looking at a single monument. He was looking at something built, buried, and rebuilt over an enormous span of time, and he devoted the rest of his professional life to it. The hilltop consumed him completely. His most provocative idea was also the one that has outlived him. For as long as anyone had thought about it, the story of civilization ran in one fixed direction. People learned to farm. Farming produced surplus food. Surplus food freed people from the daily hunt. And only then, with leisure and security, did they build temples and organize religion and raise monuments. Religion and ritual were treated as luxuries that came at the end, paid for by the harvest. Schmidt looked at this hilltop and proposed that the sequence was backward. The temple, he argued, came before the farm. The impulse to build something sacred, something shared, something larger than any single life, may have been the very force that drove scattered people to gather, to stay, and eventually to plant. In his reading, organized belief did not follow civilization. It helped create it. It is worth being careful here because this remains Schmidt's interpretation rather than settled fact, and he framed it as a hypothesis to be tested. But it was a hypothesis with teeth. If he was right, then one of the most basic assumptions about how human society began had the order of its events reversed. The monument was not the reward for civilization. It was the cause. That single inversion sent shockwaves through archaeology and turned a remote Turkish hilltop into one of the most argued oversights on Earth, and it left a vacuum, because if these people built a temple before they built a farm, before writing, before metal, before any of the scaffolding we assume sophistication requires, then the question of who they actually were became impossible to ignore. Schmidt had handed the world a mystery far larger than a pile of carved stone. Into that opening rushed a flood of explanations, and almost none of them had anything to do with the people who had actually lived there. Asterisk. When something this old and this impressive turns up in the record, imagination tends to arrive before science does, and imagination, it turns out, is remarkably creative when faced with something it cannot easily explain. The theories began almost as soon as the site became publicly known. For some, the sheer scale of the place was proof enough that ordinary ancient humans could not have been responsible. Something else must have been involved, something greater. And from that single assumption, an entire ecosystem of alternative explanations bloomed. There were those who pointed to the Anunnaki, the deities of ancient Sumerian mythology, recast by certain popular authors as visitors from another world who handed early humans knowledge and technology far beyond anything Stone Age people could have developed alone. Others connected the hill to the Watchers, described in the Book of Enoch, a fallen order of celestial beings who, according to that text, taught humanity forbidden arts. One author went so far as to link the site directly to the Garden of Eden, which is a creative leap given that the Book of Genesis says nothing whatsoever about Adam and Eve organizing a large-scale limestone carving operation. Then there is the lost civilization theory, perhaps the most persistent and seductive of all. The argument holds that an advanced civilization, predating the end of the last ice age, sophisticated, technologically capable, and now completely vanished, was responsible for places like this one. In this telling, a catastrophic cosmic impact triggered a climate disaster that wiped the civilization from the earth, leaving only its monuments behind as ghostly evidence that it ever existed. It is a compelling narrative. It is also, when you examine the evidence carefully, a narrative in search of facts rather than the other way around. Two researchers have even claimed that one of the pillars functions as an astronomical chart, recording a precise cosmic catastrophe. A reading that requires the builders to have mapped the very same constellations that would not be defined until thousands of years later. Related ideas about the site's alignments and possible stellar connections are genuinely interesting as hypotheses, but they remain firmly in the territory of educated speculation rather than established archaeology. What all of these theories share beneath their surface differences is a single unspoken assumption that the people of the ancient Near East, the actual human beings who lived and worked and died in this region roughly 11,000 years ago, were simply not capable, not intelligent enough, not organized enough, not sophisticated enough to have done this themselves. That assumption has deep roots in 19th century thinking about cultural evolution, in the idea that prehistory meant primitiveness, that people without writing or metal stood somewhere closer to animals than to us. It is a deeply condescending view, and it is wrong. Every fringe theory about this place, no matter how elaborately constructed, ultimately rests on that same crumbling foundation. But the archaeological record, examined honestly and in full, was already telling a completely different story. Long before a single strand of ancient DNA was sequenced, the ground itself had begun to push back, and what it was saying was far more interesting than the myths. Before DNA entered the picture at all, the soil had already started undercutting the simplest version of events, and even Klaus Schmidt's own theory felt the strain. His picture of the place leaned on a particular image of the people here as seasonal visitors, nomadic bands passing through, gathering for ritual, then scattering back into the landscape. It was a compelling picture. It just did not match what the ground was actually full of. Among the most common tools found throughout the site's sediment layers are sickle blades. Not dozens of them, tens of thousands. Sickle blades are the signature tool of cereal harvesting, shaped and worn specifically for cutting crop stalks close to the ground. Their presence at that scale is not incidental, it is diagnostic. These are not the tools of people occasionally supplementing a hunting diet with a handful of wild seeds. They are the tools of people engaged seriously, repeatedly, and systematically with grain. Alongside them lie mortar, pestles, and grinding slabs, the processing equipment of a community working plant material in real volume. Detailed analysis confirmed that many showed where from use specifically on plants from the family that includes barley and wheat. The artifact record was not describing nomadic ritual, visitors, it was describing people with a sustained working relationship with the land. Beneath their feet, the animal bones tell a parallel story. Tens of thousands of butchered remains fill the deposits, mostly gazelle and wild cattle, but also significant numbers of wild sheep, already showing the early signs of the kind of managed interaction that eventually leads to full domestication. Great feasts almost certainly took place here, some of them likely ritual, on a scale that would have demanded serious logistical organization to sustain. The architecture adds another layer still. The large circular enclosures were almost certainly roofed rather than open to the sky, which would have made their interiors dark. Enclosed, deliberately atmospheric spaces. Smaller structures scattered through the broader complex bear a striking resemblance to permanent dwellings, the kind built by people who intend to stay rather than pass through. More recent excavations have uncovered domesticated cereal grains at the site itself, strengthening the case considerably then. Then there is the construction timeline, which tells its own strange story. Across roughly 18 centuries of building activity, the quality of the work actually declined. The oldest enclosures hold the most impressive, most technically accomplished stonework. As the centuries pass, the craftsmanship grows progressively less refined, until the later structures look almost rudimentary beside the first. More than 20 separate buried enclosures, each raised over or around the last, speak to a community that returned to this hill generation after generation, century after century. The picture that emerges from all of it is not hunter-gatherers pausing between migrations. It is a community deeply embedded in a landscape, working it, managing it, standing at the threshold of one of the most consequential transitions in the entire human story, the shift from following food to growing it. Archaeology had established that much from the ground alone, but it could only describe what these people did. It would take DNA to finally say who they were. For most of human history, the dead kept their secrets. Where they came from, who their ancestors were, how far they had traveled, all of it vanished with them into the earth. Then, over the last 2 decades, ancient DNA changed that completely. Scientists learned to extract and sequence genetic material from bones thousands of years old, from teeth, and from the dense petrous bone of the inner ear, where biological material survives longest. Honesty demands a limit, stated clearly here. Usable genomes have not yet been recovered from this hilltop's own fragmentary human remains. So the answer to who built it is read instead from the surrounding world these people belonged to. Ancient genomes recovered from pre-pottery Neolithic sites in Upper Mesopotamia, published in leading scientific journals in recent years, alongside earlier genomes from central Anatolian sites, from the Levant and from the Zagros Mountains, reveal something nobody had quite anticipated. Populations living in close geographic proximity turned out to be genetically distinct from one another, each carrying its own ancestral signature, each with a deep and separate history. These were not a single interchangeable mass of prehistoric people drifting uniformly across a landscape. They were distinct communities developing largely in parallel across the same broad region over thousands of years. And running through all of it was a dominant pattern of continuity from the people who lived here before farming, through the pre-pottery Neolithic, into the centuries that followed. This is exactly where the lost civilization argument collapses. If some advanced founding population had swept through this region, teaching its inhabitants to quarry stone and organize labor and carve animals with practiced hands, we would expect to find their fingerprint embedded in the DNA of the people who came after. Some anomalous ancestry, some inexplicable genetic contribution from a population that did not belong. There is none. No hidden founders, no ghost population, no mysterious influx of outside ancestry, timed to the rise of the great enclosures. There was movement, certainly. The communities of the region carried mixed ancestry from the western and eastern edges of the Fertile Crescent and clearly took in newcomers. But that is the ordinary traffic of neighboring human communities, not the signature of a vanished master race. The builders were the descendants of people already in this ground for thousands of years, and the genetic patterns align precisely with populations in the slow process of turning toward agriculture. The genes in the soil tell the same story the sickle blades told, they just tell it with far more precision. And read alongside the archaeology, the DNA lends quiet weight to the idea that haunted Klaus Schmidt for his entire career. These were people already socially complex, already coordinating large communal projects, already managing animals and harvesting cereals before domestication was complete. The social infrastructure came first. The farming followed. Schmidt died in the summer of 2014, never seeing the genetic evidence settle behind the theory he had defended for decades. He was right about the most important thing. He simply did not live long enough to watch the science prove it. So let us put the lost civilization argument to rest properly, because it deserves more than a dismissive wave. It deserves to be dismantled with the actual evidence of what people of this era were genuinely capable of. And that evidence is frankly stunning. Start with tools. These were not people bashing rocks together and hoping for the best. They were manufacturing complex implements from stone, bone, antler, and wood. combining different materials with a technical understanding that required deep accumulated knowledge to develop. These were engineered solutions refined over centuries of trial and error. Then consider hunting. These were people who regularly brought down animals far larger and more dangerous than themselves: bison, auroch, woolly mammoths, creatures that could kill a human being without particularly trying. Taking them down did not just require courage. It required careful planning, coordinated group strategy, detailed knowledge of animal behavior, and the kind of clear/complex communication that only a fully modern human mind can produce. You do not take down a mammoth by accident. Then there is navigation, the one that tends to stop people cold when they hear it properly. Ancient peoples were harvesting deep-water tuna and sourcing obsidian from distant islands, both of which meant sailing well out into the open sea, out of sight of land, in boats built to handle open water. And the first humans to reach Australia and New Guinea crossed open ocean stretches exceeding 90 kilometers to get there. Tens of thousands of years before the first pillar on that Turkish hilltop was ever raised. The same holds for the stones themselves. Communities without any modern technology have moved enormous blocks within living memory. The Nios Islanders of Sumatra shifted stone slabs, comparable in size to the largest pillars on the hill, using nothing more than coordinated community labor. On Easter Island, researchers eventually showed that small teams could move the famous statues across the landscape in an upright position using ropes alone, effectively walking them forward. Detailed estimates for the pillars confirm that the labor involved, even accounting for uphill movement over rough ground, was entirely achievable for a settled community of a few hundred people, with planning and sustained effort. There was no miracle of engineering here. There was accumulated knowledge, social organization, and determined human work. And the DNA carries one final revelation, the most intimate of all. These people did not stay put. As farming spread westward across the following millennia, the people of this region moved with it, not in one dramatic migration, but as a slow generational expansion, carrying their seeds, their animals, their accumulated knowledge, and their genes into new territory. By the time that movement had run its course, this lineage had become one of the primary ancestral sources for the population of Europe. Modern Europeans carry a substantial portion of their genetic heritage from exactly this source, which means the people who gathered on that hilltop, who harvested wild barley and managed wild sheep and raised towering limestone pillars without metal or the wheel, are not a vanished people sealed off from us by 11,000 years. For much of humanity alive today, they are family. This place is often called the world's oldest temple, but that framing, compelling as it is, undersells what it actually represents. It is not just a monument. It is a threshold, the moment held in stone where something fundamental shifted in the human story, where people stopped only following their food and began slowly to grow it. And the DNA did not reveal God standing behind those pillars, or aliens, or a vanished master race. It revealed people, specific, traceable, entirely human people, whose story did not end on that hilltop, but traveled westward and lives on still. Amazing discoveries. Make sure to subscribe and hit the bell icon. Share this video with friends and join the discussion on what these findings could mean. Your thoughts and questions are important, so let's explore incredible mysteries together.